The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
Where does your radio story begin?
My radio story. I think like the beginning of it was like high school. I think there wasn't a lot. I grew up in a really small town, and there wasn't a lot to do. And I guess like my senior year, 90210 was a big show on television during my last years of high school. And they had this like radio station like in the school. And, that was like the coolest thing. And so we convinced the principal and the vice principal to let us bring a sound mixer in, and we had mixtapes and we would do bits and contests, and it would just play over the speakers in the school while kids were coming in every day. And we did the announcements, and that's really how it started. I didn't particularly think that it was going to ever be anything, but it was something to do senior year in a small town where young men spend most of their time fighting boredom, right? Because what happens when that sets in. And so, that was really what it was a way for us to have a bit of fun, get on the teacher's good sides, and fight off boredom.
So after high school, do you go to...
I did,
a radio school?
Yeah, I didn't have great marks, but I sort of had that. And I knew somebody who was friends with a few people. It was Q107 at the time. And I went in for a little while and just sort of like poked around and on Saturdays and helped out with pulling CDs and everything else. And so my high school grades were not great at, coming out, and I'd never really taken school all that seriously. And I started applying to colleges, and, I was like, well, what do I have? Like, what do I even do? There was nothing academic available, but we had done this radio thing in high school, and I had gone in, for a little while at Q107 on weekends when nobody even knew I existed there, because you never really met anybody. And then I applied to a few schools for radio, and Humber College was the only school that I got into. So I had one option and one option only. And then I went to Humber, and I lived on campus, and I did that whole life, which was not the healthiest for me at the time. And I left after the first year. So I did 1 year of Humber College.
Who were you pulling CDs for at Q107?
Oh, just whoever was in at the time. I didn't have a set shift. I know Rory O'Shea was weekends for a little while where he was doing a show, and I still message him every now and then, which is really crazy. He was always really great to me when I was younger. But yeah, it was cool, but it was not really what I would call like a great radio experience, just in the sense that when the hours that you were there was no way to meet anybody because you were coming in on Saturdays, right? So like anybody who would ever even be in a position to see you or talk to you or be like, hey, that guy's, kind of cool or talented. I never met anybody at the station. And so it was an experience because it was cool and it was a station I grew up listening to. But, did it really help? I don't know if it did. It got me inside of a room, and it got me behind a board, and, I'd play reel to reel tapes when I was in the building alone, right? That kind of thing. But no, it was cool. But I would go from Acton to Toronto, where I grew up, on the bus every Saturday. So I sort of gave up my Saturdays in my last year of high school to go and do that, and then Humber College after that.
Did you intern with Howard Stern?
I did, yeah. So that's sort of what happened. Was I didn't like school. I didn't like college at all because it wasn't fun. And what I mean it wasn't fun is that I had the expectation that at least a portion of radio was supposed to be fun. And I just didn't find it fun when I went to school. I wasn't learning what I wanted to learn. I thought that I was going to be learning, comedy. And I thought that I was going to be learning how to have these great conversations. And I thought I was going to be learning how to do, a show. And you sit in sales meetings, like you sit in sales classes and commercial writing classes, and they sort of give you the 360 of radio, which is great. But I was never going to go into any of those, and none of those things interested me at all. And then so at some point in my first year, I wrote a letter to the Howard Stern show. I found out who the intern coordinator was. And then they were like, wow, we've never had a Canadian intern before. Why don't you come down for an interview? And I'd never left the country before. So I hopped on a Greyhound and I went to New York and I interviewed with them, and she hired me on the spot. Well, hired me. She asked me if I wanted to be an intern on the spot. And basically what I wound up doing was spending all the money that I had for year 2 of college to live in New York for that period that I was there. So it was a decision that I made, like what was going to be better for me in the long run, which was, doing an internship with Howard Stern or, going to second year Humber. And I chose to do the internship.
Okay. I think this is a pretty important part of your story that I don't know that has necessarily been told, but tell me what you learned from Howard Stern, because Howard is somebody who had the most unique radio show in all of North America, at least that was being done terrestrially. There was a lot of knockoffs and nobody could really compare. And I think that, you've got a fairly unique show and carved out a little something. But what did you learn from Howard about how he carved out his piece of pie and the type of show he did and what went into the show?
So I was there at a crazy time. So when I was there, it was the first book had come out. The movie hadn't come out yet. And he was running for governor that summer.
So 97 is what I want to say in the
No,
book.
90,
Private Parts?
94.
Oh.
94. It was the summer of the OJ chase.
Oh.
That was a summer because the Knicks were in the playoffs. The Rangers were in the playoffs. World Cup was there that summer. It was a massive summer in the city.
And by the way, anybody who does Get the 30 for 30, June 16, 1994 is the name of that, just to get a whole idea of those three things that you talked about.
Yeah, and it was crazy there, right? What did I learn? I mean, I learned everything that I learned because I didn't know anything going in there. But as far as a show and a large show, I think that one of the most incredible things that you sort of see when I was there anyway, which was that the show didn't happen outside of the studio, right? So when you walked into those offices, it was not a chaotic frat boy kind of mess, right? It was very much an office, and people were laughing and everybody was crazy. But the show didn't happen outside of the studio. And what I never really understood was listening to the show, and as I was a fan of the show, is I never understood the role of, at the time it was Jackie and Fred, and how much they wrote for the show, because I always knew Howard called them writers, but I never knew how that worked on a live show, right? And it was actually quite incredible to see, because as the show was going on, Jackie had a table in front of him, and he had a camera that pointed down at the table, and he would write a joke or a line as the conversations were going on a piece of paper, and he would slide it underneath the camera. And then Howard had a monitor beside him that showed what was on that camera. And so if he used the line, then he used the line. If he didn't. And so at the end of the show, the floor was covered in pieces of paper with just Sharpie scribbles on it. And I learned that is how you can use writers during a live show, because I'd never seen that sort of thing done before. How a broadcaster can have a writer live in the moment while you're actually having a conversation with them. And so that was pretty eye-opening for me. And I think just the sort of grandness, and maybe it gave me a false sense of what radio was. But when he was at K-Rock at the time, like they had a giant boardroom for all of the sort of radio executives and everything else. And that giant boardroom became his office, right? Like they took over the radio station. Like that entire radio station was just based around that show. And so it was just the grandness of it, that something could be this big, right? And I think that what it wound up doing at the time was it sort of set the bar for anybody who ever experienced that show in the building. It set it higher for you. And you realize like just how far things can go in this business. And it was, if nothing else, it was just inspiring, really. Everybody there, that this giant machine was able to put chaos on the air every day, but in a very organized way off the radio, was really inspiring.
Did you take the Greyhound back to Toronto?
I left early because I wasn't in a really good place. It was not the right time for me to be there, and I wasn't healthy, and I wasn't mentally healthy. And Mom may have flown me home when I left, because I know when I decided to leave, I needed to leave right then, because it was not going to be a good place for me if I stayed.
So I can imagine financially it would be really tough, because I remember I had friends who had apartments in New York in 1994. It is not like the TV show Friends.
No,
to say the least. Incredibly expensive. I seem to recall the rent was, in the thousands and thousands of dollars, and then you still have some roommates. And as well, I guess the chaos that you would be working in, you're working in a very, high stress environment.
Yeah. That
I can totally understand how you would feel. I need to go home.
Yeah, and it was, to be honest, like it was that part of it was great. My mom found me housing at NYU, and it was a 1-bedroom. So there's a living room and a bedroom, and there was 4 of us. So there's 2 of us in the bedroom and the 2 guys sleeping in the living room. And it was sort of very New York, and I didn't mind that at all. But the stress of being there for me was, I went down there not in a very good place, and I was sort of running from whatever problems that I was dealing with at the time. I wasn't healthy. I was self-harming a lot. and I was going through some really terrible things. And I thought that running from that and hiding there would fix everything. And it didn't. It just made everything worse. It just came out because the one thing that I hadn't dealt with up to that point was loneliness. And I'd been so close to my brother who I grew up with and I'd lived with my whole life. And this is my first real time away from him. And so I was lonely for the first time. And I realized that I wasn't built for that, or I wasn't yet built for that.
What'd you do when you got home?
I moved, my brother moved to Toronto. When I was in New York, he moved to Toronto. And as soon as I moved back, I moved in with him and we've lived together since.
What about broadcast wise? What did you do after?
I met Paul Cook from 680. And he was like really great and taught me a lot. He was working on a couple of different shows, and I was sort of just doing chase producing for him, which is just calling around the world and just trying to convince people to come on shows. And that was really good because Paul was like this sort of first person, in the business who looked at me and saw any sort of potential, which was really great. And we're still great friends, Paul and I. Like, we are incredible friends. But yeah, no. So he was really the one that kind of turned me around because I was going to leave radio for sure. I wasn't enjoying it. I didn't know if I wanted that life. And it was very difficult to get a job. And I wasn't a smart guy at the time. And so he was the one that sort of gave me my first shot. And I thank him every day when I see him in the halls still that, he is the reason that I sort of do everything that I do now.
And so that's a Rogers property.
Yeah.
A very busy radio station because it's news round the clock and a wheel, and you got people on and off and production. Did you stay in that Rogers building for long?
I left and I went to, did I stay there long? It's hard to even tell because I've been at Rogers 3 times. I left and I went to produce television, right? I was a writer in news and public affairs and producer on TV. And then 9/11 happened. And after 9/11 happened, you started to tell the same story every single day. And it was devastating to work in news at that time, just because everything you did hurt. Everything you did was depressing. Everything you did was a story that was hard to tell and hard to write and hard to chase. And then right around after that time, my father got sick and my dad was dying. And I realized that I just needed fun in my life. Like, if I was going to still work in television, I needed fun. And then this station, Toronto 1, started up. And they were producing a late night show. And I went in to interview to be the executive producer of the late night show. It was this show called Last Call. And I didn't get the job. And they called me and said, hey, we're going to go with somebody else as the EP, but do you want to come in and audition to be one of the hosts for the show? And at this point, I'd never done any on-air stuff, and I wasn't interested in doing on-air stuff. But I knew that I needed to have a little bit of fun and I needed to get out of the sort of news wheel. And so I went in and I auditioned to be a host on this show. They were hiring 4 people to be this host. It was a late night show that took place in a bar, and it was a working bar. So there was like customers and everybody else in there. And then I wound up getting that job. And that was my first on-air job. And I was a month away from being 30. So as far as the on-air stuff goes, I was kind of late in the game, like a late bloomer when it comes to people. I wasn't one of these guys that I was doing on-air shifts at radio stations, in my early 20s. Like, I didn't take my first on-air job until I was 30.
Yeah, and it was a lot of television too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you did some stuff in the bar, and then I think you were with Toronto 1 for a while, and then I think what comes next is Global.
Yeah, ET Canada. So yeah,
and now it's national. Now I know who you are.
Yeah, and it was ET Canada was really crazy because we had this thing at Toronto 1. So they canceled the bar show, and then they built an entertainment news magazine show, sort of like ET whatever, right? It was called the A-List, and that show and that station was such a disaster. And that station was destined to fail. But when you look at the people who came out of that sort of pocket of people, so it's myself, very first on-air job, Dina Pugliese, it was her first on-air job, Tracy Moore, Arissa Cox, who's the host of Big Brother Canada, Andrea Bain, and then over on the news side, it was, God, who was there? There was somebody else that was there. But it was a stacked lineup, and everybody who worked at that tiny little station went on to do these really, really great things. And it was, so for that part at Toronto 1, we all knew it was going to end because there was no way that it couldn't. But when you were there, you realized that you were working with some incredibly talented people, and it was really great. So that station was failing, and then one of our producers went over to Global. And then one of our senior producers went over to Global, and they were building this new entertainment show. Nobody knew that it was Entertainment Tonight Canada because the deal with Paramount hadn't been done yet. And I was the only one who had a contract at Toronto 1 that would allow them to jump from one to the other. Everybody else had some sort of non-compete, and my lawyer at the time wound up making sure I didn't have any of that, which was great. And so they were looking for people, and I was the first person hired for ET Canada. So it was the executive producer, the director, a guy named Frank Sampson, and then I think they hired a jib guy because they were friends, and then me. And so I was hired before Cheryl was hired, and I wound up sitting in Cheryl's audition. They made Cheryl audition for the show. And so we built this show. But when I was hired at ET Canada, it was called Global Entertainment. It wasn't even called ET Canada until they could announce the deal with Paramount. And then sort of ET Canada just took off, and I was there for 17 years.
And a great piece of Canadian content that could count as news.
Yeah.
And great relief, by the way, for anybody who's looking to get away from the depressing stuff out there, which is why, by the way, I always thought Entertainment Tonight worked, because it followed the news back in the day.
It did. And, the crazy thing about ET Canada is, I never had this, I never loved it, right? Like, it was never really my thing. You just sort of get good at it. And that's what I relied on. I saw an episode we launched ET Canada in 2005. And for the first couple months, I would watch them when I could. I would tape it on VHS at the time when I got home. But I think the last episode of that show that I saw was 2007. And I never watched the show after that. I never knew what it looked like. I never knew when we changed our graphics. I never knew when we changed the music. I just would just go in because I liked interviewing people. Like, that's what I liked doing. It's not that I loved being on that show. I just loved doing interviews. And so that's what I would go and do. And I would put all my sort of time and effort into doing interviews. And then when we started doing the live show, but I was never really interested in everything else they did on the show. But man, did I love working with those people. They were an incredible group of people to work for. And that was the hard part of leaving that show, was leaving the people that you just laughed with every day.
Having spent some time with Natasha Gargiulo on this show, and working with her in the past, and she and I talk quite often, she still refers to it as family, even though it's not continuing. You were all family. Yeah.
Natasha's a great one because she sort of came in on wave 2 when we started hiring new people, and we welcomed her in, and she crushed everything that they asked her to do, and she was really great. It was hard when Natasha and we had another reporter in Vancouver at the time named Aaron Sebula. It was hard when they left, or when they were asked to leave. They didn't leave; they were asked to leave. It was hard because you really, you love those women and love what they brought to the show, and you don't want to see somebody hurt when they put so much into something. And the sacrifice for a show like that is time, because they traveled a lot. In the first years of the show, I traveled a lot. We had a brand new baby at home, and I was in Los Angeles 3 weekends a month. And I would finish, when I started doing the radio show, I would finish the radio show at 9 a.m. at the time. I would have my bag with me at the station. I would get in a car. I would go to Pearson. I would be on an 11 o'clock to Los Angeles. I'd land in LA. I would work that night. I would do interviews all day Saturday and then Sunday morning. And then I would get back on a plane to come back to Toronto, and I would land at 11:30 p.m. on Sunday night, get home at about 12:30, and then wake up and do the radio show again. And I would do that for 3 weeks in a row, right? Without break kind of thing. And so it's an exhausting thing. And so you really feel like you're putting a lot into it. And so when somebody gets let go, it hurts more because of the amount of themselves that they gave to it.
When did Kiss 92.5 come calling?
2009, I was in Los Angeles because Michael Jackson had died. And I was covering that for ET Canada. And Kiss was coming back. And I had worked at Kiss in the early 2000s. I was Mad Dog and Billy's producer. And I'd left there, and Kiss was coming back and Julie Adam was bringing Kiss back. And I'd worked with Julie earlier and she gave me an incredible opportunity when I needed an opportunity. And people were blowing up my phone being like, oh my God, you got to do this. You got to do this. You got to call her. You got to call her. And then I wound up writing Julie a letter while I was in Los Angeles to tell her why she needed to take a chance on me to do the morning show. And I'd never hosted a radio show before. I never introduced a song on the radio before. I've still never introduced a song on the radio before. I've never run a contest. I've never done any of that stuff. And then I had convinced Julie because my fallback was, hey, listen, let me just do this because what do you got to lose, right? The other thing is that if I'm horrible at it, just fire me because I already have a great job. I already work at ET Canada. Like, you're not going to hurt my feelings and my family's not going to starve or anything else. If this does not work out, just tell me to not come back in. And by the time I was flying home from Los Angeles after covering the Michael Jackson funeral, Julie had offered me the job. And so I signed on early on, tentatively, but then it became, how do I do the radio show and ET Canada at the same time? Because I only wanted to do both. And that's sort of where the two companies, which didn't have a great history of playing nice together, let alone sharing people, and one great lawyer who was my lawyer, brought everybody together at the time, and everybody worked it out, and they figured it out that I could wake up at 3:30 in the morning and do a 5-hour radio show, and then leave there and go and do ET Canada until 6 o'clock every night is when we finished taping, basically, and then drive home and then still travel on the weekends, right? So it was an incredible schedule. I was doing, 16 hours a day, every day, but they worked it out and I was able to do both. And I did both for a very long time.
Is that the birth of Roz Mocha?
Yeah, because I signed on to do the show and Mocha was hired as well, but Mocha was hired to do afternoon drive. And when I got hired, Julie Adams started giving me all these tapes of people who, when it came out that I was doing this show, who wanted to do the show with me. And it was extremely flattering because there were some great broadcasters in there and some people who were employed at the time at other stations in the city. And the more I listened to these tapes, the more I realized that I was going to fail with every single one of them. Even just on a demo alone, I knew I would have no connection to any of them. And in all of those tapes was Mocha's tape. And she just had it because she asked for it when she hired him to do afternoons. And I listened to Mocha's tape and I was like, this is the guy. Like, this is the only guy. I realized what I was looking for, and I was looking for everything. And Mocha was everything. And she said, well, shit, that's great because he's already hired. So we'll just slide him over from afternoon drive to the morning show. And then she went to Mocha and she was like, hey, listen, Roz really loves your tape and wants you to come and do the morning show with him and build a show. And he said, no, he didn't want to do it. He had been doing mornings in Kitchener. And he didn't want to do it. And he's like, no, I'm fine. I'm going to do afternoons. And then I was like, well, oh my God, I'm dead, right? Like the whole thing is dead. And then it took him, a little while and he came around and that's sort of more his story as far as, his realizations and his own feelings towards it. But he did come around and then we were able to kind of build this show that, at the time will probably be the last time another show gets this opportunity. And we talk about this all the time, which is now when you have shows starting and they're bringing two people together who have never worked together, or even two people that have worked together, stations are very careful and you do test shows. They'll put you in a studio, you'll do a couple test shows, you'll run some bits, stuff that will never see the light of day. And then you go and you sit with the boss and you work out the kinks kind of thing. Where when Mocha and I started this show, we met once before we started this show. And we hadn't really even met before this. And we met once. It was at a bar and there was a third person there with us who was our assistant music director at the time. And we had talked about the show and what we wanted for the show for about 20 minutes. Then we had a couple of drinks and dinner and we left. And then the next time we saw each other was that day when the show started. And so, you will never again have somebody hire two people to do a morning show in a city like Toronto on a station like KISS, which was a brand new station at the time, where it's like, okay, you're hired and you're hired. And then you just show up one day and do a show, like without really planning anything. And we hadn't planned anything. More so, we didn't want to do anything. And so we fought like hell because we were like, I don't want to do traffic. I don't want to do weather. I don't want to have somebody come in and do news. We don't want to do any of that stuff. So we took out all of that stuff out of the show just so we could do comedy and sort of go on rolls with things, right? I wanted to be able to take lots of calls and I didn't want to be interrupted. And so that's how we built the show. That was a sort of foundation of the show was, there was no structure as opposed to, right now, like we have way more structure now than we did then. Like there was no net and no structure when we started the show.
So from what I'm hearing is that Julie Adam got out of the way for the first few months. Does that feel...
Yeah,
I guess
she did. Yes. Yeah. What Julie did was Julie is the biggest fan and has the best eye for talent of anyone that I've ever seen in my life. Julie's incredible. And Julie knew me because we had worked together before. Julie knew Mocha because they had worked together before. And Julie saw something in me and she saw something in Mocha and already knew that there was no chance being taken on talent. It was just building a show and chemistry and figuring each other out. So she knew that that was the hurdle. It wasn't figuring out whether we were good enough. She just let us figure out the sort of dynamic of us. And what Julie did was she sort of let us be us in those first couple of months. And then what she was doing on the other side was guarding the gate from the bosses and the consultants and the everything who were telling her, what in the hell are you doing? And what she would say is just give it time. It's going to work. And that's what she did, is that she was the sort of defender of us in those first couple of months.
Yeah. A good program director when building a new show has to be the most excellent of shit shields.
Oh, she was incredible. She's still incredible. I could say Julie doesn't even work with us anymore. And I could call Julie and be like, oh my God, this guy's really got my ass. I need your help. And Julie would help, like without question.
So how far into Roz and Mocha before you were comfortable that this is totally working and we're going to ride this?
Yeah, I didn't have a lot of expectations because I didn't know what to expect. Like I didn't know what it felt like to build, something that was going to be successful. And to be honest with you, I didn't know whether the show was great. I mean, it made me laugh, right? And that's sort of all you have when you're in a room at 6:00 in the morning with one other person. Made me laugh. I was having a good time, and then you just hope that other people do. But I think that the one thing that we did early on with that show is something that is different from the way that they tell other people. Most people, when you get into this business, especially if you're new and you're doing a show, they will tell you to figure out what the audience is talking about, what they're interested in, and talk about that, sort of like reflect the audience. Where Mocha and I have never done that. I've never once talked about something on the show that I'm not interested in. We only ever talked about the things that we were interested in, because if we're interested in it, chances are we can make it interesting enough that the audience would be interested in it. And so that's how we built the show. And then when you keep going over time, the audience then feels like they are a part of this friendship that you have, where you're two funny people who are making each other laugh and ripping on each other, but also doing some stuff that'll make you cry and also doing some stuff that is extremely helpful for people that need it at the time. And that's how we did it, because we never once sounded like we were talking about something that we didn't believe in 100%. And I think that that's where we started in a different place than most shows.
How close are the two of you after hours?
After hours, we don't hang out. We barely talk, but I think that is not because of anything. Like, I love him. He's one of the greatest people I've ever met in my life, and one of the most important key people that I've met in my life, but we've just never hung out. And it's like a thing that freaks the audience out. Like, we don't hang out. Like, we'll text memes to each other during the day, but we don't sit on the phone or fire emails back and forth and do a lineup of stuff that we're going to talk about on the show the next day. Like, we just don't do that, and we never have. The whole thing with our show is you got to be ready to laugh, you got to be ready to lose, and you can't let the other person down. And that's just it. Come in, work hard, and be ready. And it's like everybody else that we have on the show now with the other cast members that are on the show. It's like, if you're called upon, be ready. That's the only rule. Just be ready. And when you tell somebody that, it sort of puts them in a position to work on themselves and their own performance. I don't want to work on somebody else's performance. I just need them to know that the only thing I need you to do today is to figure out a way to be better tomorrow without relying on the things that made you great today. And that's the only thing I need is just get better. Every single day, just get better.
Has there ever been a point where you thought throughout the 14 years that you've been together that, okay, I think the show's going to end, where the show could cease?
Zero. None. Never. Not once. Not even when we had terrible ratings all those years ago when every day I should have thought about that. Every day I should have thought about that the show was going to get canceled. But I never did. And that wasn't because of arrogance. I think it was just because we were just so focused on the show that I was never interested in anything outside of the show. The thing that makes Mocha and I a little bit different is I don't care if we win, right? Mocha cares if we win. I care about other things on the show. I care about the flow of things and the content and whether what we're saying is helpful, what we're saying is truthful, what we're saying is funny. Like I care about all that stuff. Mocha does too, but our main focuses are sort of other things, right? Like he cares very much if we win, where if somebody sends me ratings, then I get them and it's like, cool, great. That's awesome. And then Mocha and I will text, we'll be like, congratulations. That's great. But I'm certainly not ratings focused and I never have been.
What's the best thing a program director can offer you?
I would say that, and I've worked with some great program directors. We've been really lucky in that world. When it comes to working with performers, I think that the first thing they need to do is concentrate less on the performance and more on the person, because once you start understanding the person first, the performance stuff kind of comes into place. You understand why they make decisions. That's the first thing. But I think the most important thing is to figure out what motivates the person you're talking to, because everybody's motivated by different things. Some it's praise, some it's creative freedom, some it's space. But when it comes to coaching and guiding and offering advice, I think you really need to figure out, you can't do a one size fits all when it comes to coaching or advice or being a PD. Somebody like me, right? So Paul Kay, who is I don't even know what he is now. I think a VP, but he was our program director for a while. He figured me out real quick. And somebody like me, if you want me to go in a different direction, okay, it is never a good idea to tell me to not do something. What you should do is tell me to do more of something. Right. So if there's part of my performance that you sort of feel maybe isn't the best, or you want us to switch gears or not go in a specific direction, don't tell me to not do that, because I will only do more of that. Right. So I'm the kind of person where I'm like, don't tell me to not do something. Tell me to do more of something. So find the thing that you think works and just tell me to do more of that. And then this problem will sort of fix itself.
Tell me about going from local to national. And that's not to say that this show isn't local, but you have to make a jump, and Howard Stern does it, and now it's your turn to add some extra radio stations to the roster. And did you have to change much, or did you just continue to do the same show?
Yeah, our show wasn't really local. I mean, it was, but it wasn't like, we never felt that we had to insert local into the show. We always felt that whatever we were just interested in is what we would talk about. So we never felt the need to do local things. If local happened, then local happens. We were never guided by that. The sort of live local thing, it never interested me. Did we have to change things? Yes. And I wish we hadn't, because when you are in Canada, we just don't have the amount of radio stations that you do in America. Like if you look at New York State and then Massachusetts and then, Pennsylvania, and you sort of go down all the way to the East Coast, there's 150 stations that a show like ours could be on. But when you look at Canada, the way we have with time zones and the amount of stations we have, there's not a lot of stations. And so when our show went to Winnipeg, we give them a version of the show. It's not really our show. It's not our show that starts at 6 a.m. in Toronto and then we just replay the whole show in Winnipeg. And I wish we did, because I feel that it would be a better show. They get a version of our show, which is extra breaks that we have. And then we'll take the news breaks and we'll sort of fill them in as, talk breaks. And we don't do certain things on the show that we like. None of our games, we don't play our games there because, I guess people can't win, but I still think that they're fun to listen to. And anyway, it's a version of our show. I wish it was our show. The Ontario stations, the Ontario North stations are our show, and they crush, we crush in Northern Ontario, which is really wild. And the people have just been so engaged with the show. And we hear from the people in, Timmins and North Bay and Sault Ste. Marie, like constantly. Like they've just become incredible fans. So they're wonderful. And then the other versions of the show is evening versions. So in Ottawa and Edmonton and somewhere else, I'm not sure, it's an evening show. So it's a 2-hour version of our show cut to an evening show. And those do really well. The response is great to that. So there's a lot of different versions of the show that are on the radio. And in order to be able to pull that off right, you need to hire people, and you need to build a machine that can handle the workload, because now we have 5 PDs and we have 5 sets of expectations, and we have, 5 different contests, and we have all of this stuff that we have to now run. And the one thing that it is now, our reality is, from the time that we walk in every day, there is not a second that we're not working for the show. Like, I ask to go pee like I'm in grade 5. Like I'll look at Mocha and I'm like, do I have time to pee? And he will either say yes or no. And that is literally the only break that you have from the entire time, because we're not doing stuff for Toronto. We're doing stuff for all the other stations.
You touched on loneliness earlier on.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, tell me about your personal experience going through the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, as a whole, we're all going through it. And I think people are relying on you and your show for company.
The one thing we never did on the radio show was we never missed a day. And when I say never missed a day, we never missed a day in the studio. We never did the show from home, not one single day. They shut the building down for 2 years. And there were days where, like, me and Mocha and a couple guys in the newsroom were the only people in that building. And it was dark. They saved money by not even turning the lights on. And we went in, we figured out a way to do the show in the building, because it still needed to feel like the show. And also, I didn't want to have to talk about the pandemic all the time. And that's one thing that being in the studio normalized that experience for us. And so we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about COVID. And I think that when everybody else went, because a lot of people used it as a gimmick working from home, because, oh my God, hey, look at us, we're flattening the curve and we're working from home. But when you work at home and, you make that decision, and then when you go back to work 2 weeks later and you realize, okay, so it was a bit, right? But we never did that. And what it allowed us to do was to make the decision to just not go heavy on COVID in the show. We would talk about, like the important things that people needed to know, and like what legislation was happening and what the mayor was doing, all this stuff. We did that, but we felt it was extremely important to just do our show. And so we went in every day during COVID and just did the show we would have done had it not been COVID.
Was it therapeutic?
It was, in the sense that you didn't feel trapped, right? Like, I never felt trapped. I still had a place to get up and go to every day, where most people did not. And I felt terrible for those people, especially if, you could see people slipping. And a lot of people slipped during that time, during COVID. And it was just not an option for us. And we were never going to do the show from home. Like, we were never going to do the show from I did the show from home twice, and when I got COVID twice, and I never missed a show. I had a kit that I had at home, and we made sure it sounded great, and I got COVID. And I think the first time, I didn't tell people that I had COVID. We just did the show because I didn't want to dwell on COVID, because I knew that was not the right way to go.
When did you decide to write a book?
Years ago is when I decided to write the book. I got approached to write the book years ago, but they wanted a celebrity sort of thing. Here's all the behind the scenes of all the famous people I've interviewed, and I wasn't interested in that. And the book came around because I knew I had a story to tell. And it's just a matter of being brave enough to sort of put it all down on paper. And then I met an agent, and that's your sort of first step in wondering if you even have a book, if your idea is even a book, as you sit down with an agent. The agent was like, yeah, let's sort of work on this. And then I took, 6 months with him, and we worked on the proposal for it, which is writing chapters and, sample chapters. And it's a lot to even get it to a publisher. And then when we sold it, I think the whole time was about 1.5 years, maybe even 2, writing it. And it was an emotional experience writing the book. And I knew what the book was, and I knew that it was sort of unusual. Listen, I was a late 40s man writing a book about feelings, and it wasn't an easy thing to do. And I cried every day while I wrote it. I laughed every day while I wrote it, but it was incredibly emotional. And I sort of knew that going into that process of talking about, the things that I talked about, whether it be grief or mental health issues or whatever it was, I knew that it was going to be helpful. And if it was only one person that found it helpful, to me, that was enough to get me through all the hard parts that were extremely difficult to relive and retell.
We all do feel a little bit broken inside.
It's true.
what is the best way to not feel so broken?
I don't think it's about not feeling broken. I think that it's about figuring out how to rebuild. And I think that that's one of the big problems, especially with young men, is, the thing that terrifies us the most about admitting that there might be something wrong is rebuilding. And that's a tough place to be. We can tear ourselves apart, but the reason we don't is because how do you then put it all back together again so you're a whole person? And that's why people don't ask for help in a lot of situations, is because they're terrified to be taken apart because, how do you put it all back together again? And so when I had come up with the idea of a little bit broken, it was, you're not ruined, you're not used, you're not spoiled, and you're certainly not beyond repair, but you just got to learn how to rebuild. And that was what I went through. And I sort of go into great detail of that sort of rebuilding process that I went through. And it's not perfect. And I'm still far from perfect. And there's a lot of stuff that still eats away at me and bothers me, but I don't hide it anymore. I hid Tourette's on television for 17 years when I was on TV. And I don't know why, is I didn't have to, but I just didn't. I always had this great fear of being somebody's problem. And I never wanted to put any of my stuff on anybody else where they felt responsible for anything that I was going through. And so I hid it, and I hid everything that I was going through. But then I realized that coming out of the other side, and I met a great woman who's my wife now, Catherine, and we had a kid, and I slowly started to rebuild over the years. The radio show helped a lot with that. And I came to terms with a lot of things. I finally dealt with the loss of my dad. You sort of just start to rebuild, and it's a long process, right? It's a really, really long process. And it was at that point where I realized that maybe this story would be helpful.
What I love about podcast right now is all the stories that are coming out involving radio. And Roz and Mocha are a story, 14 years.
Yeah.
And you got a docu-series that's on the way. Why is now the time to do this?
So good. One, because you build this podcast network and this podcast feed, and it's a monster that you got to feed, right? You got to do this. But also the fans have really supported us. And I don't know how usual it is for radio shows to have the kind of fans that we have. I'll give you an example, right? So when I released the book, we did a book signing at Indigo in Toronto, and I didn't know what to expect at the book signing, and Indigo didn't know what to expect, and my agent didn't know what to expect, and the publisher didn't know what to expect. And so we showed up, and we brought the whole radio crew, and our DJ Climax was spinning live in the bottom of Indigo and all of this stuff. And 550 people showed up. And it was the second biggest book signing that Indigo had ever done. And I was like, well, who was number one? And they were like, Bruce Springsteen. And I was like, God damn, these fans, right? And then anytime we do something, the fans rally. And fan service is what I love. I love when I'm a fan of something, and then the artist or the property, the IP, whatever it is, they do these things specifically for fans, right? I'm a big fan of fan service. And when we started the podcast was 2016. And then sort of the podcast starts in 2016 and continues on for today. But from 2009 to 2016, there was a story. It's sort of like our origin story of how the show started and all that craziness that we did in those early days. And so there's a lot of fans of ours who don't know what that story actually is. And so we put together the 6 1-hour episodes, and we have this incredible archive, because the one thing that Mocha and I did do when we started this show was we kept everything. Even at a time when people didn't keep stuff, we kept everything. We have everything from our very first break on that morning in 2009 until what we did today on hard drives. Every single thing we've kept.
Okay, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Because and I think this is a lesson for any talent. If you don't save it, nobody else is going to save it. And I thought I was smart. Yeah. And I saved a whole bunch of stuff, and I put it all in reel-to-reel tape, and then I left it at the station that I was at, figuring it would be there. And then eventually they threw them out one day, and then you don't have anything anymore.
Yeah. But
nobody will do it for you.
They will not. And they won't. And it's completely up to you. But so in this docuseries, all the clips of that first show that we did, it's all in the docuseries, right? All that stuff from early on, those first couple of years, when I came into work the next day after my kid was born, and I did the show because I just had this incredible story that I needed to tell about my kid just being born. And we have all of that. We have all those breaks. That's all sort of like the stuff that's in the docuseries. But really the docuseries is about a radio show. And I think personally, it's one of the most in-depth looks at building a radio show and the mechanics behind it. And we go in deep. Like we talk about our contracts. We talk about job offers that we've had. We talk about all that stuff in the docuseries. But I think that at its core, it's really a story about a friendship. And it was two people from two completely different worlds. I grew up one way and Mocha grew up a very, very different way. We came together. He said no, eventually said yes. We don't talk or hang out outside of the show. So it's really, the beautiful thing about this story is imagine if you had a best friend where every single conversation you had with your best friend, the history of your friendship, every conversation you had when you realized that you guys were best friends was all on tape, because that's what we have, right? Every conversation that Mocha and I have ever had together is in the archives. We don't really talk outside of the show. And so our story of friendship is everything that is the show, right? It's what the show is built on. And so that's sort of what we put on display. And that's the sort of overall story that we tell with this. And then that's what the fans love, right? And that's sort of what they've grabbed onto.
I think with morning shows and really any form of entertainment, it takes 3 years to build an audience. We talk about that often, whether it's podcast radio stations or morning shows. Around 7-8 years, you've got something. But now you've done the 7-8 years, I think, twice.
Yeah.
So now you've sort of captured 2 generations of listeners and built that audience. And people come, people go, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they do. And, you don't realize how long you've been doing the show until you start getting calls. And I would say for anybody in this business, if you set a goal for yourself of what you consider to be longevity or what you consider to be success, because success is completely subjective and everybody has their own version of success. Some people's success may be the advertisements that we have for this show that are on billboards and buses, right? That's success for some people. Some people it's ratings, some people it's money. But what we realized it was when we started getting calls from people where they would say, hey, I listened to you in my last 2 years of high school. And you're like, okay, cool. And they're like, now I'm a doctor and I got 2 kids. And you're like, that's a lot of life, right? That's a lot of life. And a few of our fans that grew up listening to the show went on to become famous, right? Which is another real trippy thing to do. Like, Simu Liu from Marvel, who was Shang-Chi and he was on Kim's Convenience. Like he listened to the show every single day going to the GO station in the car with his mom and dad. Alessia Cara, same thing. Like we were a part of their world. Not that we mattered in the sense that what they became, but I think the great thing is that there was a part of their life where they were really on to doing great things and crushing their goals where we sort of rode together. Right. And that's, it's really incredible to hear. But when you start talking like what you said of just, sort of multi-generational stuff, it's really wild.
How much fun are you having every day? As much as you did from day one?
Yeah. I always say the worse my day is I laugh. Right? That's sort of really it. And now it's much easier. You've been on the air almost 15 years and it's a machine and you sort of know what to do every day and it just keeps getting bigger, right? I think that's the sort of motivating thing now is that the show is not getting smaller. It's only getting bigger, whether it's through the podcast or through adding it to more stations or just through ratings or creative freedom that we still manage to get. It's just growing. And so, yeah, it's fun. It's the time of my life every day.
Roz, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.